Welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy, the podcast where we break down complex metabolic ideas into clear, actionable insights. I'm your host, Marco Lane, and today we've got something exciting lined up. We're diving into Generative Energy Podcast number 3, hosted by Danny Roddy with guest Georgi Dinkov. If you're familiar with their work, you know this episode covers a wide range of fascinating topics, from the surprising metabolic benefits of vitamin E to the misunderstood relationship between cortisol, depression, and aging. But here's the kicker. We're going beyond just a surface-level recap. We're going to unpack these ideas in more detail, break down the science behind them, and help you connect the dots. You'll hear about why vitamin E is more than just an antioxidant. It's a metabolic powerhouse. How progesterone influences not just fertility, but also long-range thinking in both men and women. The shocking link between cortisol, dad bods, and what some researchers call a mild form of Cushing syndrome. Plus, why the keto diet might actually be setting your liver up for insulin resistance, and how something as simple as blocking endotoxin could help reverse type 1 diabetes. This is part 1 of our 2-part series covering this podcast, and trust me, you won't want to miss a minute of it. All right, let's jump in with our first topic, vitamin E. Why was Ray Peat so adamant about its importance, and why did Georgi Dinkov go to great lengths to recreate the exact formula Peat swore by? Let's break it down. All right, let's kick things off with a deep dive into the fascinating world of vitamin E. Now, in Generative Energy Podcast number 3, Danny Roddy and Georgi Dinkov talk about why Ray Peat considered vitamin E such a crucial part of metabolic health. But here's the thing. This isn't just your typical vitamin E is good for you narrative. There's a lot more going on here. Georgi shares how Ray Peat often referenced a particular kind of vitamin E from the 1960s and 70s, a formula that's nearly impossible to find today. So, let's rewind and start with the basics before we get into why that older version was so unique. Vitamin E, more than just an antioxidant. Most people think of vitamin E as just an antioxidant that helps protect cells from damage. And while that's true, it doesn't tell the whole story. According to Peat and Dinkov, vitamin E is actually a metabolic regulator with multiple key functions, including 1. Estrogen antagonism. Vitamin E blocks estrogen's effects, which can help restore hormonal balance, especially in individuals with estrogen dominance. High estrogen, as we'll discuss later, is a big player in conditions like osteoporosis, cancer, and even brain fog. 2. PUFA neutralizer. It helps counteract the damage caused by polyunsaturated fats, PUFAs. Now, PUFAs, as Peat often warned, are highly unstable and prone to oxidation, which can cause inflammation and metabolic stress. Vitamin E essentially steps in to neutralize that oxidative chaos. 3. Lipolysis inhibitor. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Vitamin E can actually reduce lipolysis, the process of breaking down stored fat into free fatty acids. Why does that matter? Because excessive lipolysis floods the bloodstream with free fatty acids, which can block glucose metabolism and lead to insulin resistance. 4. Progesterone supporter. Vitamin E doesn't just mimic progesterone's effects, it can also stimulate its production. Progesterone, as Peat often emphasized, isn't just a fertility hormone. It's a metabolic stabilizer, an anti-stress agent, and, as we'll see later, a key to understanding brain function. The missing piece, polycosanols. Now, let's get back to that special version of vitamin E Ray Peat talked about. Georgi mentioned that Peat's preferred product came from wheat germ oil and contains something that modern supplements are missing, polycosanols. So what are these polycosanols, and why are they so important? They're long-chain saturated alcohols found in things like sugarcane wax and wheat germ oil. Unlike unsaturated fats, these compounds help push PUFAs out of cells and improve mitochondrial function. Plus, they naturally support cholesterol metabolism by helping convert cholesterol into protective hormones like progesterone, DHEA, and pregnenolone. Now, Georgi went on a bit of a detective journey to recreate this formula. He found that most modern vitamin E products are derived from soy, not wheat germ oil, and are higher in gamma tocopherols rather than the alpha tocopherols that Ray Peat preferred. So he contracted a lab to use CO2 extraction to isolate the pure tocopherols and polycosanols, removing any PUFA remnants. Why does this matter for your metabolism? So, what does all of this mean for everyday health? Well, when you supplement with a high-quality wheat germ-derived vitamin E, you're essentially giving your body tools to lower estrogen dominance naturally, protect tissues from PUFA-induced oxidative stress, support progesterone production and mitochondrial function, and even improve circulation by reducing nitric oxide, a free radical that Peat linked to inflammation, aging, and poor energy metabolism. In the podcast, Georgi even mentions how vitamin E can mimic progesterone's calming, anti-stress effects. So, if you've ever used progesterone and noticed clearer thinking or reduced anxiety, you might experience something similar with the right kind of vitamin E. Key takeaway. Vitamin E isn't just a generic antioxidant. It's a metabolic multi-tool. From blocking estrogen to boosting progesterone and supporting mitochondrial energy production, it's one of those underrated supplements with effects that go far beyond what you'll see on the label. All right, now that we've got a handle on vitamin E's role in metabolism, let's move into our next section. Progesterone. Why did Ray Peat often describe it as a thinking hormone, and how does it shape how men and women think differently? Stay tuned. All right, welcome back. Now, let's shift gears and talk about a hormone that most people associate exclusively with women, progesterone. But as Georgi Dinkov and Roddy discuss in Generative Energy Podcast number 3, progesterone plays a critical role in both men and women, especially when it comes to thinking, stress resilience, and metabolism. Ray Peat often referred to progesterone as a thinking hormone, not just because of its calming effects on the brain, but because it supports higher-level, long-range thinking. So let's break down why that is and how it plays into the differences in how men and women think. Progesterone's role in the brain. First off, progesterone isn't just about fertility or pregnancy. It's a neurosteroid that directly affects brain function. Here's how. 1. Calms the stress response. Progesterone acts as a natural brake on the brain's stress pathways. It suppresses cortisol, the primary stress hormone, and reduces the overactivation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal HPA axis. 2. Supports mitochondrial energy. It enhances mitochondrial efficiency, increasing ATP production, basically the fuel for all brain activity. More ATP means better focus, improved memory, and less brain fog. 3. Inhibits nitric oxide and serotonin. Progesterone inhibits nitric oxide, NO, and serotonin, two compounds that, when excessive, can slow brain activity, increase anxiety, and promote depressive states. 4. Enhances neuroplasticity. It also promotes myelin sheath growth around neurons, helping the brain communicate more efficiently. So, when Peat talked about progesterone as a thinking hormone, he wasn't just talking about cognition in a vacuum. He meant that progesterone helps the brain stay sharp, resilient, and adaptable, even under stress. Progesterone across the sexes. Here's where it gets really interesting. Georgi mentioned that before puberty, boys and girls produce almost identical amounts of progesterone. But once puberty hits, that changes dramatically. In females, progesterone production skyrockets due to ovarian activity. In males, testosterone production takes center stage, and progesterone levels drop significantly. So, what does that mean for thinking patterns? According to Ray Peat, progesterone's long-range, big-picture thinking becomes more dominant in women, while men tend to focus more on linear, task-oriented thinking. This isn't a stereotype. It's just how hormones shape brain activity. Roddy mentioned something pretty interesting here. He said that when he takes progesterone, he feels like his thinking shifts. He finds himself more contemplative, more reflective, less focused on immediate tasks, and more on broader, long-term patterns. The synergy of male and female thinking. Georgi also talks about how this divergence in hormone profiles plays into the way men and women think together. It's like nature created a complementary system. Progesterone-driven female brains often excel at long-term planning, empathy, and social intuition. Testosterone-driven male brains tend to focus more on immediate tasks, structural problem-solving, and action-oriented thinking. So, in a sense, the synergy between these two ways of thinking can create a more balanced, adaptive perspective, whether we're talking about relationships, parenting, or even scientific discovery. Progesterone's role in aging and brain health. Now, here's the kicker. As both men and women age, progesterone production declines, while cortisol, the stress hormone, increases. This shift is particularly problematic because cortisol, when chronically elevated, can cause brain fog, depression, reduced cognitive flexibility. In fact, Peat suggested that many symptoms of age-related cognitive decline are actually symptoms of chronic progesterone deficiency. So, what can you do? Well, Georgi and Danny point out a few practical ways to support healthy progesterone levels. 1. Ensure thyroid function. Thyroid hormone is crucial for progesterone synthesis. If thyroid function is low, progesterone levels tend to crash. 2. Use vitamin E. As we discussed earlier, vitamin E can mimic progesterone's effects and support its synthesis by blocking estrogen and reducing inflammation. 3. Minimize PUFA intake. Polyunsaturated fats interfere with steroid hormone production, including progesterone. So, cutting down on PUFA-rich foods like vegetable oils can help maintain hormonal balance. 4. Supplement progesterone if needed. Georgi noted that some men and women have seen cognitive improvements with 10 to 100 milligrams of topical progesterone. But as Peat often advised, it's best to cycle progesterone to avoid receptor desensitization. Key takeaway. So, the next time someone tells you progesterone is just a female hormone, you can let them know it's actually one of the most powerful metabolic and cognitive regulators we have. Whether you're male or female, progesterone helps keep the brain sharp, stress at bay, and thinking more expansive. Up next, we'll explore something that might surprise you: the link between declining androgens like DHEA and the development of osteoporosis. Stay tuned. All right, let's dive into something that often gets overlooked: the connection between declining androgens, progesterone, and osteoporosis. In Generative Energy Podcast number 3, Georgi Dinkov and Roddy discuss how mainstream medicine tends to blame estrogen deficiency for osteoporosis, especially in postmenopausal women. But Ray Peat's perspective turns that idea on its head. The hormonal reality of osteoporosis. The common belief is that osteoporosis happens when estrogen levels drop after menopause. But Georgi points out that research shows estrogen isn't actually low, it's just unevenly distributed, with estrogen levels in tissue often being far higher than what blood tests suggest. The real issue? A drop in protective hormones like progesterone and DHEA. In men, a decline in DHEA, not testosterone, is strongly linked to bone loss. In women, progesterone levels crash after menopause, leaving bones vulnerable despite normal or even high tissue estrogen levels. How these hormones protect bones. Progesterone and DHEA support bone health by 1. Promoting osteoblast activity. These hormones stimulate osteoblasts, the cells responsible for building bone. 2. Inhibiting inflammation. Both progesterone and DHEA counter inflammatory mediators like nitric oxide, which damage bone tissue. 3. Opposing cortisol. Cortisol breaks down bone by increasing osteoclast activity. Progesterone and DHEA act as natural cortisol antagonists. The estrogen myth. As Georgi explains, estrogen dominance, not estrogen deficiency, is the bigger problem, especially after menopause. Tissue samples often show high estrogen levels alongside low progesterone. This imbalance disrupts the bone-building process and can increase the risk of osteoporosis, even in women who never took hormone replacement therapy. Practical takeaway. So, what can we learn from this? Maintaining optimal progesterone and DHEA levels, alongside supporting thyroid function and reducing PUFA intake, can do far more for bone health than focusing solely on estrogen. Coming up next, we'll discuss aspirin's surprising role in metabolism and why it's far more than just a painkiller. Stay with us. Now let's talk about a household staple with surprisingly profound metabolic benefits: aspirin. In Generative Energy Podcast number 3, Georgi Dinkov and Roddy discuss how aspirin isn't just a pain reliever. It's actually a metabolic ally with anti-inflammatory, anti-fibrotic, and testosterone-supporting effects. Aspirin, beyond the medicine cabinet. Aspirin has been around for over a century, but Ray Peat often highlighted its metabolic advantages that go far beyond its reputation for relieving headaches. Here's what makes aspirin so special from a bioenergetic perspective. 1. Anti-inflammatory superpower. Aspirin inhibits prostaglandins, those inflammatory messengers that contribute to pain, stress, and tissue damage. Prostaglandins, particularly the estrogen-promoting ones, are reduced when aspirin steps in, helping to restore a more balanced hormonal environment. 2. Testosterone support. Yes, you heard that right. Aspirin can help increase testosterone by blocking aromatase, the enzyme responsible for converting testosterone into estrogen. Georgi mentions a study where aspirin outperformed pharmaceutical blood thinners like Xarelto when it came to preventing clots, and it did so while supporting healthier testosterone levels. 3. Mitochondrial booster. Aspirin supports mitochondrial function by improving the activity of cytochrome C oxidase, a key enzyme in energy production. When mitochondria work better, metabolism speeds up, and the body becomes more efficient at burning fuel and resisting stress. The anti-fibrotic effect. Georgi highlights aspirin's ability to prevent fibrosis, excess tissue scarring that contributes to liver disease, cardiovascular issues, and even cancer. Aspirin achieves this by lowering serotonin, nitric oxide, and other inflammatory markers that promote fibrotic changes. Reconsidering the risks. Now, we've all heard the warnings about aspirin and bleeding risks, but Georgi mentions recent studies showing that aspirin reduces the risk of fatal brain bleeds and even protects the digestive tract when used at appropriate doses. Practical takeaway. So aspirin is more than just an old-school painkiller. It's a metabolic multi-tool that reduces stress, supports testosterone, and even helps the body resist fibrosis. Next up, we'll explore how cortisol plays a starring role in the aging process and how it might just be behind the so-called dad bod. Stay with us. All right, welcome back. Now let's shift gears and talk about cortisol, the stress hormone that might just be the master architect of aging. In Generative Energy Podcast number 3, Georgi Dinkov and Roddy delve into the profound effects of cortisol on the brain, body composition, and overall metabolism. What's even more fascinating is Ray Peat's assertion that every symptom of aging can be reproduced by administering high doses of cortisol. Cortisol, the aging hormone. Cortisol isn't inherently bad. It helps us survive by raising blood sugar during stress. But when stress becomes chronic, cortisol turns from helpful to harmful. It breaks down muscle, stores fat around the midsection, and accelerates brain aging. Georgi describes this as a mild form of Cushing syndrome, a condition where cortisol runs rampant. And if you've ever wondered why middle-aged men start developing that classic dad bod, cortisol is the culprit. It increases visceral fat, especially around the belly and upper back, while simultaneously eroding muscle mass. As Georgi puts it, these are the same features seen in Cushing's disease: moon face, buffalo hump, and a decline in lean tissue. Brain aging and depression. Here's the scary part. Cortisol doesn't just impact the body, it also shrinks the brain. Georgi mentions studies showing how elevated cortisol levels damage the hippocampus, the brain's memory center. This cognitive decline often presents as depression, and Ray Peat suggested that what we call depression might just be the brain aging prematurely due to chronic stress. Natural cortisol antagonists. The good news? The body has built-in cortisol antagonists. Progesterone blocks cortisol's effects at the receptor level. DHEA counters cortisol's catabolic impact on muscle tissue. Pregnenolone reduces cortisol synthesis while supporting brain function. The takeaway. Cortisol is a survival hormone, but when it lingers, it accelerates aging, cognitive decline, and fat accumulation. As Georgi says, the best defense is to reduce chronic stress, support thyroid function, and consider progesterone or pregnenolone if needed. In the next segment, we'll explore why low-carb diets, especially keto, might actually increase cortisol and lead to liver insulin resistance. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy. In this next segment, we're tackling something that might surprise a lot of people: the hidden dangers of the ketogenic diet. In Generative Energy Podcast number 3, Georgi and Danny break down why keto, despite its popularity for weight loss, might actually increase your risk of insulin resistance, especially in the liver. The myth of keto as a metabolic fix. For years, keto has been marketed as the ultimate metabolic reset: cut carbs, burn fat, and become a fat-burning machine. But as Georgi explains, the reality isn't so straightforward. When you drastically reduce carbs, your body compensates by releasing more cortisol to maintain blood sugar levels. Remember that cortisol's job is to raise blood sugar during stress, and cutting carbs is perceived as a stress signal by your body. Cortisol and the liver. So what happens next? Elevated cortisol triggers excessive lipolysis, fat breakdown, which floods the liver with free fatty acids. Over time, this leads to liver insulin resistance, a hallmark of prediabetes. Georgi references a study where researchers found that keto diets cause liver cells to become insulin resistant due to excessive fat accumulation and metabolic stress. The Randle cycle in action. Georgi also brings up the Randle cycle, a metabolic mechanism that explains why fats and carbohydrates compete for oxidation. On a keto diet, the constant influx of fats blocks glucose metabolism. Over time, this makes your cells less responsive to insulin. As Georgi puts it, it's like jamming one fuel line while flooding the other with excess fat. The bigger picture. This liver insulin resistance can snowball into broader metabolic issues. While keto might initially lower blood sugar, it does so at the cost of metabolic flexibility. The liver becomes sluggish at processing glucose, which explains why people who try to reintroduce carbs after keto often experience intense blood sugar spikes. Practical takeaway. So, what does all this mean for those trying to improve their metabolic health? Don't fear carbs. Your body needs glucose for optimal energy and brain function. Focus on metabolic flexibility. Avoid extreme diets and prioritize balanced meals with natural sugars from fruit and honey. Watch your stress. Chronic dieting increases cortisol, which sabotages liver function in the long run. Georgi's conclusion here is pretty clear. Keto might offer short-term results, but it sets the stage for long-term insulin resistance. Coming up next, we'll talk about the surprising link between endotoxin and type 1 diabetes, and why blocking endotoxin might hold the key to reversing it. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy. In this next segment, we're diving into one of the most eye-opening revelations from Generative Energy Podcast number 3, the surprising connection between endotoxin and type 1 diabetes, and why blocking endotoxin might actually help reverse the condition. The mainstream view, the emerging evidence. Most of us have heard the conventional explanation for type 1 diabetes. It's an irreversible autoimmune condition where the immune system destroys insulin-producing beta cells in the pancreas. Once these cells are gone, that's it, lifelong insulin dependence. But Georgi Dinkov challenges that narrative by pointing to recent research suggesting that these beta cells might not be dead after all, just suppressed. And what's suppressing them? Endotoxin. What is endotoxin exactly? Endotoxin is a toxic byproduct released by certain bacteria in our gut. When the gut becomes permeable, often from stress, poor diet, or intestinal inflammation, this endotoxin leaks into the bloodstream. Once there, it sets off a cascade of inflammation, including the release of nitric oxide, which can impair energy production in cells and disrupt immune function. Endotoxin's role in diabetes. So how does endotoxin fit into the type 1 diabetes picture? Georgi explains that endotoxin binds to a receptor called TLR4, toll-like receptor 4, which is heavily expressed in pancreatic beta cells. When TLR4 is activated, it triggers inflammation that blocks insulin production. In one groundbreaking study, researchers genetically deleted this TLR4 receptor in diabetic mice. The result? Their beta cells began producing insulin again, without any external intervention. In other words, the beta cells were never destroyed. They were just metabolically silenced by endotoxin-triggered inflammation. Ray Peat's insights on diabetes. This lines up with what Ray Peat has been saying for decades. Diabetes often isn't an autoimmune mystery, but a metabolic dysfunction. Peat pointed to two primary culprits. 1. Excess free fatty acids, PUFA, which block glucose metabolism and stress pancreatic cells. 2. Excess nitric oxide production, often driven by chronic endotoxin exposure. When these two factors are present, insulin production stalls and blood sugar skyrockets, hallmark features of diabetes. What can be done? So if endotoxin is such a powerful metabolic disruptor, what can we do about it? Georgi mentions several practical strategies. Improve gut health. Regularly eating raw carrots, cooked mushrooms, or bamboo shoots can reduce endotoxin-producing bacteria. Lower PUFA intake. Polyunsaturated fats destabilize gut integrity and increase endotoxin absorption. Support metabolic function. Vitamins like niacinamide, which inhibit excessive fat breakdown, can help restore pancreatic beta cell activity. The big picture. This research suggests a major paradigm shift. Type 1 diabetes might not be a permanent condition. Instead of focusing solely on insulin replacement, addressing the metabolic environment, specifically endotoxin and PUF-A levels, might help restore natural insulin production. Coming up next, we'll talk about cortisol's surprising role in aging, depression, and that all-too-familiar dad bod. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy, where we're breaking down key insights from Generative Energy Podcast number 3 with Roddy and Georgi Dinkov. In this segment, we're tackling a hormone you've probably heard of, cortisol. It's often associated with stress, but as Georgi and Ray Peat have highlighted, cortisol plays a much bigger, more insidious role in aging, depression, and yes, the classic dad bod. Cortisol, from survival hero to metabolic villain. So, cortisol isn't inherently bad. In short bursts, it helps you survive stressful situations, like running from danger or dealing with an acute illness. But when cortisol stays elevated chronically, it becomes a silent saboteur of your metabolism, muscle mass, mood, and even your body composition. Ray Peat once said, "All the symptoms of aging can be reproduced by administering an extra physiological amount of cortisol." Let that sink in. Everything we associate with getting older, muscle loss, fat gain, brain fog, and depression, can be mimicked by simply elevating cortisol. Cortisol and the dad bod phenomenon. Now let's connect the dots to that infamous dad bod. Georgi explains that middle-aged obesity is, in many ways, a mild form of Cushing's syndrome, a condition characterized by excess cortisol. Cushing's causes muscle wasting in the limbs, fat accumulation around the belly and face, and a sluggish metabolism. Sound familiar? Here's how it works. 1. Cortisol breaks down muscle. It converts muscle tissue into glucose to fuel the stress response. Over time, this leads to weaker, smaller muscles. 2. Cortisol promotes fat storage, especially around the abdomen, back, and face. This is why middle-aged men often develop that stubborn belly fat, even when their overall diet hasn't drastically changed. 3. Cortisol suppresses thyroid function. Since thyroid is the primary driver of metabolic energy, this suppression makes it even harder to burn fat and maintain muscle. Depression as brain aging. But cortisol doesn't just wreak havoc on your waistline, it can also age your brain. Georgi points to research showing that high cortisol levels reduce brain energy production and impair neurotransmitter function, leading to depression. In fact, depression might just be accelerated brain aging caused by chronic stress and energy failure. If you've ever had brain fog, low motivation, or persistent low mood, cortisol may be a hidden contributor. Natural cortisol antagonists. So how do we fight back against cortisol's destructive effects? Georgi shares that the body actually has natural cortisol antagonists, hormones that keep this stress hormone in check. The 3 big ones are progesterone, often dismissed as a female hormone, but crucial for stress resilience in both sexes. DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, helps maintain muscle mass and suppresses excessive cortisol. Pregnenolone, the precursor to many protective hormones, including progesterone. Supplementing with or naturally supporting these hormones through proper nutrition, adequate carbs, and good sleep can dramatically reduce cortisol's grip on your body. Practical takeaway. So, if you've been struggling with stubborn belly fat, low energy, or persistent low mood, consider cortisol as a potential culprit. Low-carb diets, excessive cardio, and chronic stress all push cortisol higher. And as Georgi and Ray explain, reversing that requires giving the body the fuel it needs, especially carbohydrates, and supporting it with anti-stress nutrients like vitamin E, aspirin, and thyroid. Next up, we'll discuss how low-carb diets, particularly keto, can cause liver insulin resistance and actually increase your risk of diabetes. Stick around. This one's going to surprise you. All right, welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy. In this next section, we're diving into a dietary trend that's been all the rage for the past decade, keto. From Instagram influencers to mainstream doctors, everyone's been praising the ketogenic diet as the ultimate hack for fat loss and metabolic health. But as Georgi Dinkov and Ray Peat explain, keto might not be as metabolically friendly as advertised, especially when it comes to your liver and insulin sensitivity. The keto paradox. So here's the paradox. Keto diets often lead to short-term fat loss and lower blood sugar, which looks great on paper. But underneath the surface, the liver tells a different story. A recent study discussed in the Generative Energy Podcast found that ketogenic diets actually increase liver insulin resistance. Now, why is that a big deal? Because insulin resistance in the liver is a key predictor of diabetes development. If the liver can't properly respond to insulin, it struggles to store glycogen, regulate blood sugar, and manage fat metabolism. Over time, this sets the stage for metabolic dysfunction. How keto disrupts liver function. Here's the simplified version. Low carbs equals low glycogen stores. The liver stores glycogen to maintain stable blood sugar levels between meals. Without adequate carbs, glycogen runs low, forcing the body into a stress state. Increased cortisol. To maintain blood sugar without glycogen, the body releases cortisol to break down muscle into glucose. Chronic cortisol elevation, as we discussed earlier, leads to muscle loss, fat gain, and a sluggish metabolism. Excess fat flooding the liver. On keto, the liver is flooded with fatty acids. When these exceed the liver's capacity to burn them, fat builds up in the liver, promoting insulin resistance. Georgi highlighted how this exact process mirrors the development of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, NAFLD, a condition that now affects over 50% of the adult population in the U.S. The Randle cycle connection. Now, let's connect this to the Randle cycle, a concept Ray Peat often discusses. The Randle cycle describes how the body either burns fat or carbs for energy, but not both simultaneously. On keto, the body becomes temporarily efficient at burning fat. Sounds good, right? But here's the catch. Excessive fat metabolism inhibits glucose metabolism by design. So when you reintroduce carbs, your body struggles to process them efficiently, leading to temporary spikes in blood sugar and what's often misinterpreted as carb intolerance. Why the initial weight loss is misleading. Georgi pointed out something interesting. Keto-induced weight loss often results from glycogen depletion, water loss, and muscle catabolism, not just fat loss. The body sheds water when glycogen is depleted, creating rapid but unsustainable weight changes. And because cortisol rises to maintain blood sugar, it starts breaking down muscle and connective tissue. The long-term result? A slower, more sluggish metabolism. What's the alternative? So if keto isn't the magic bullet, what is? Georgi suggests a diet that supports mitochondrial function and cellular energy production, primarily through carbs, especially sugars from fruit, honey, and well-cooked starches. These foods replenish liver glycogen, keep cortisol in check, and promote healthy insulin sensitivity. In fact, Georgi referenced a study where participants consumed large amounts of fructose without gaining fat, as long as their fat intake remained low. Why? Because fructose primarily replenishes glycogen and supports metabolic flexibility rather than being directly converted into fat, as keto proponents often claim. Key takeaway. The keto diet might work for quick weight loss, but it comes at a metabolic cost. Liver insulin resistance, elevated cortisol, and long-term hormonal imbalances are the hidden downsides that few influencers mention. Next, we'll look at another popular myth, the belief that calorie restriction is the best way to lose weight. As we'll see, calorie restriction triggers the same cortisol response we've been talking about, leading to more stress, not sustainable fat loss. Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy. In this section, we're going to tackle a dieting myth that just won't die. Eat less, move more. It sounds simple, right? But as Georgi Dinkov and Ray Peat point out, calorie restriction and excessive exercise don't just fail most people. They often trigger hormonal changes that actually promote fat gain. Let's break it down. The stress hormone connection. When you cut calories, your body interprets this as a form of stress. It's not trying to sabotage your diet. It's trying to keep you alive. From an evolutionary perspective, calorie restriction signals famine. And what does the body do during a famine? It ramps up stress hormones like cortisol to conserve energy and mobilize stored fuel. Now here's the kicker. Cortisol doesn't just burn fat, it breaks down muscle tissue for energy while encouraging fat storage, especially around the midsection. This process is so reliable that researchers often describe the dad bod phenomenon in middle-aged men as a mild form of Cushing syndrome, a condition caused by chronic cortisol excess. The study on caloric restriction. Georgi highlighted a study where obese men followed a low-calorie diet. The results? Their cortisol output increased significantly, even when they didn't lose weight. That's right, Even without actual fat loss, calorie restriction alone pushed the body into a chronic stress state. And guess what? This cortisol spike made them hungrier, more fatigued, and more prone to storing fat when they inevitably ate more later. The psychological toll of dieting. Dieting doesn't just stress the body, it stresses the mind too. In the same study, participants reported higher levels of perceived psychological stress. The combination of physical and psychological stress creates a perfect storm for long-term weight gain. And this is why so many people experience the infamous yo-yo dieting cycle. They lose weight initially, but the body compensates by raising cortisol, slowing metabolism, and increasing hunger signals. Once they return to normal eating, they quickly regain the lost weight, plus some extra, just in case another famine hits. Long-distance running and the endotoxin factor. Georgi shared an eye-opening detail here. Long-distance runners, despite their lean appearance, often deal with digestive issues, specifically runner's diarrhea. Why? Because repetitive, prolonged exercise physically agitates the intestines, increasing the release of endotoxin, a bacterial byproduct that triggers inflammation and raises cortisol. Endotoxin also drives serotonin production in the gut, which sounds like a good thing until you realize excess serotonin contributes to fatigue, digestive issues, and even depression. So, when you hear about athletes hitting the wall, it's often not just exhaustion. It's a biochemical consequence of elevated cortisol, serotonin, and endotoxin. Why calories aren't the enemy? So if calorie restriction and excessive cardio are problematic, what's the alternative? Georgi and Ray recommend focusing on nutrient-dense, energy-supportive foods, especially carbohydrates that replenish glycogen and keep cortisol levels in check. Think of glycogen as the body's fuel reserve. When it runs low, cortisol rises to compensate. But when glycogen stores are full thanks to sufficient carbohydrate intake, the stress response stays muted, and the body can burn fat efficiently without breaking down muscle. Key takeaway. Calorie restriction might yield short-term results, but the long-term metabolic costs are significant. Instead of fighting your metabolism with low-calorie diets and excessive cardio, support it with foods that fuel cellular energy, like ripe fruits, honey, well-cooked starches, and even sugar in the right context. Up next, we'll debunk one of the most persistent dietary myths, the belief that fructose turns directly into fat. Spoiler alert, it doesn't. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to Exploring the Roots of Energy. In this next section, we're going to tackle a pervasive myth that's been floating around for decades. Fructose turns directly into fat. You've probably heard it from fitness influencers, mainstream nutritionists, and low-carb advocates. The idea is that eating fruit or sugar supposedly overwhelms your liver and causes fat accumulation. But, as Georgi Dinkov explains in Generative Energy Podcast number 3, this is a complete misunderstanding of how fructose metabolism works. So let's set the record straight. The origins of the fructose fear. The myth largely gained traction from studies done with rats fed massive amounts of pure fructose, levels that would be impossible to reach through normal human diets. We're talking about force-feeding rodents the equivalent of half a kilo of sugar every day. Naturally, their livers became overloaded, and they started producing fat. But this isn't representative of what happens when humans eat fruit, honey, or sugar in moderate amounts. How fructose is really metabolized. So what actually happens when you consume fructose? 1. Glycogen first. Fructose doesn't immediately convert to fat. Instead, it primarily replenishes glycogen stores in the liver. Glycogen acts as the body's emergency fuel tank, especially for the brain and muscles. If glycogen stores are low, like after exercise or an overnight fast, fructose is quickly converted to glycogen, not fat. 2. Metabolic efficiency. When glycogen stores are full, only then does the liver consider converting fructose into fat. And even when that happens, the process is far less efficient than the mainstream narrative suggests. As Georgi points out, research shows that you'd need to consume around 500 grams of sugar, about 8 cans of Coke in a single sitting, before the liver starts converting significant amounts of fructose into fat. 3. Human versus rodent studies. The studies that demonized fructose typically involved rats with very different metabolisms. In humans, fructose consumption in the context of a balanced, low-fat diet doesn't cause fatty liver. In fact, there was a fascinating study Georgi mentioned where rats were allowed to drink Coca-Cola freely without any dietary fat. Surprisingly, they didn't gain weight. In fact, they actually became leaner. The role of PUFA in fat gain. So if fructose isn't to blame, what is? Georgi and Ray Peat point to polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFA, as the primary culprit. PUFA, found in vegetable oils, nuts, seeds, and processed foods, disrupt mitochondrial function, increase insulin resistance, and promote fat accumulation. Here's how it works. When you consume sugar alongside a high PUFA diet, the body struggles to metabolize the sugar properly. Instead of burning glucose efficiently, PUFA inhibits glucose oxidation and encourages fat storage. Over time, this leads to fatty liver, insulin resistance, and metabolic dysfunction, conditions often unfairly blamed on sugar. Glucose versus fructose, the bigger picture. Both glucose and fructose are essential for maintaining metabolic health. Glucose directly supports cellular energy, while fructose enhances glycogen storage and helps regulate stress hormones like cortisol. Ray Peat often referenced studies showing that sugar, when consumed as part of a balanced diet, can actually improve metabolic efficiency. For example, a mouth rinse with glucose has been shown to reduce fatigue in endurance athletes, even without swallowing it. Key takeaway: the notion that fructose directly turns into fat is a myth based on flawed studies and misinformation. The real issue isn't sugar, it's the metabolic damage caused by PUFA and the stress response triggered by low-carb, high-fat diets. So the next time someone claims that fruit or sugar makes you fat, remember, your body is designed to use sugar as fuel, not store it as fat. All right, that wraps up our breakdown of Generative Energy Podcast 3 with Roddy and Georgi Dinkov. We covered a lot today. Everything from vitamin E's unexpected role as a metabolic booster to how cortisol and stress can mimic the aging process in the brain. It's fascinating how these bioenergetic principles tie together, and how things like endotoxin, free fatty acids, and even restrictive diets can have such a profound impact on metabolism and health. Ray Peat's work continues to challenge the mainstream narrative around hormones like estrogen, cortisol, and serotonin. And as we saw with the vitamin E discussion, sometimes the simplest substances, like aspirin or a well-sourced vitamin E supplement, can have incredibly protective effects. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts, especially if there's a particular part of the podcast that stood out to you. And hey, if you haven't already, check out the full Generative Energy Podcast number 3 on Roddy's channel to hear more of the original discussion. Thanks for tuning in to Exploring the Roots of Energy. I'm Marco Lane, and I'll catch you next time as we continue diving into the fascinating world of bioenergetics, metabolism, and health. Until then, stay curious, stay energized, and remember, good health always starts with strong energy.